Thanks so much for tuning into this conversation with Saurabh Mukherjea. He looks at the macro and micro with aplomb, and it's good to have him to just understand how is he looked at the budget and the math and the implications thereof. Saurabh, great having you. Thanks for joining in. We're doing it post
Thank
markets.
you.
Would have had time to reflect upon this as well. Does the math completely add up for you, or were there one or two areas where you thought more could have been done or should have been done?
No, I think the Brad maths broadly stacks up. The FM is saying 10.5% nominal GDP growth, which makes sense. She's saying 11% revenue growth, which also makes sense. She's not fudged the figures with a big disinvestment number. The disinvestment number is around 60,000 crores, which sounds doable. The tax cuts are fairly, at the overall level, the tax cut she's saying will only cost her 35,000 crores. So the math stacks up. It's a solid performance by what is now a very confident finance minister. I've seen her now gaining in confidence in the last three budgets. And I thought there was a solid show, 5.9% targeted fiscal deficit. It hits all the right notes from the perspective of both an economist and, say, a stock market investor like myself.
Saurabh, so I was trying to think of where does is there not a devil in the detail, but a hitch in the detail, if you will. I'm not saying there is one. I'm trying to understand your perspective. The capex uptick and a large number there. Fisc deficit consolidation continues. I know there is savings in subsidies, but the assumptions on the small savings rate, non-market, is that a tad too aggressive, or do you think that is achievable again?
I think, look, in a way, the government is probably looking at the FD rates that some of the banks are offering, right? And I think they're seeing FD rates are being offered of 9% by some of the private sector banks and some of the public sector banks. And it's also relatively clear that garnering deposits is a tough task beyond, say, the top private sector banks, beyond, say, a large effective CASA machine like a HDFC Bank. By the way, we have a stake there. But beyond that, garnering liability has become tough. The cost of liability has gone up, and in that context, the small savings rate going up isn't a surprise. I'm not so sure the maths is that aggressive. Neeraj, I think the maths makes sense. The only thing that we need to remember is we're a large free market economy. We are the fifth largest economy in the world, 3.5 trillion. The budget increasingly matters less. Whatever little relevance fiscal details had, that's now in GST and in PLI. And therefore, it's not surprising that the market moves on from the budget within the matter of minutes of the finance minister's speech ending. The market no longer lingers on the budget. Sumliya done. Let's move on with our lives as the market's point of view on the budget.
Got it. Sort of this whole thing of the capex drive 3 years in a row and a very large number on a fairly large base in the third year. Does that have, for example, I'm just trying to understand, does it have portfolio implications? My last two questions. Does it have portfolio implications for Marcellus, for example? Because I'm just trying to understand that, do you think that there is more impetus needed in your portfolios towards capex beneficiaries or manufacturing beneficiaries by virtue of what the government is signaling almost every single budget for the last three?
Yeah. So we are glad that the FM is spending on infrastructure. I think that's the third year in a row where India has upped government capex by 30%. But it's worth keeping a sense of scale here. Even with the heightened spend, as the FM said, the government capex will be 4.5% of GDP. Private sector capex will be, that means private sector capex will be nearly 26-27% of GDP. By far, the overwhelming driver of capex in India remains the private sector, nearly 6 times larger than the government in terms of capex spend. And beyond that, whether we look at government capex or, say, private sector capex, it's very difficult to find companies which have a competitive advantage in that sector. In civil construction, you cannot possibly have a competitive advantage. आप जितना मर्जी L1 projects कर लो government के लिए or for the private sector, if you do capex projects for the private or public sector, very difficult to have competitive advantage. There are a few companies with competitive advantage in transmission and distribution. We look at them from time to time. We haven't been able to muster courage to buy them. There are a bunch of companies that supply ancillaries, spare parts, materials into the capex ecosystem. Some of them have competitive advantage. Some of them sit in our portfolios. But the broader piece around government capex, even at 4.5% of GDP, is not the biggest driver. By far, six times larger is private sector capex. And if one wants to understand capex, you're better off focusing on that rather than jumping up and down as as the government does much needed capex for the country.
Okay. My final question, Saurabh, and that is around what's in store, because as you said, the budget comes and goes and people should move on. There is an FOMC, there is an RBI policy, and there is, due to other factors, not linked to the budget necessarily, but technical factors around certain stocks, the Adani Group stocks, etc., and the volatility there or otherwise, there has been some jitters in the Indian markets in the last few days. Today was no exception. What do you think is in store in the very near term? And now I know you look at or you invest with a very long term perspective in mind. I'm requesting you kind of also don your ex sell side hat and tell me, how do you think about the slightly near term as well?
Well, look, the stars have aligned the right way for India. To give the government credit, several years of conservative fiscal management has borne fruit. The fisc is a sensible place. Inflation is coming back down. The central bank is doing sensible things. So the stars have aligned rightly for India. I think for several years to come, will be the fastest growing large economy in the world. And that should bode well for both domestic investor flows and foreign investor flows. What we do have to keep in mind, however, though, is whether it was 10 years ago, whether it is 5 years ago, today, or 5 years hence, corporate governance, clean accounts is a huge priority for domestic investors and foreign investors. And therefore, given the scale of what's transpiring on this whole Hindenburg-Adani episode, the sooner our regulators can give a degree of clarity on the subject to investors around the world, both domestic and foreigners, the better it will be for flows into the country. But macroeconomically, the country looks in the best shape it's done for 10, 11 years. The specifics around the governance episode, I'm sure will be addressed in the next few weeks.
Great. Saurabh, always a pleasure talking to you, as short as it may be. Thank you. One. But thank you so much for taking the time out. Lovely having you, and look forward to having more on.
Thank you very much.